Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world, and welcome once again to day two of the international conference here at OUCIP Hyderabad. We're absolutely privileged to have amongst us Professor John Mccourt from the University of Macerata in Rome, Italy. John is a noted Joycean expert, and he has interest in 19th and 20th century Irish literature as well. John absolutely captured my imagination in the lockdown period last year with his regular inputs from Italy, his notes from Italy, his diaries from Italy. It was such a wonderful humanist document that I could not let go of this opportunity of inviting John to join our conference here today. Without further ado, therefore, John's going to talk about those entries, the gestation of those entries, and how he saw the entirety of Italy and Europe. In fact, I would like to think, going by the entries that I have read, they are entries which reflect on the condition of mankind in microcosm at that point in time, in that point in history. So, without further ado, John, it's over to you now to enunciate, to talk about those diaries, those experiences that you've had in the last year. Share it with us, please. John.
Thank you very, very much. It's a real pleasure and an honor indeed to be asked to address this conference. And I will, as you said, try to talk about the diary. I called it, the title of my talk is A Diary for Hope in a dystopian moment. To begin, when we use the term dystopian, I think we are denoting an imagined state or society where there is great suffering or injustice. However, in a dystopia, the root of that suffering is normally a nasty or a cruel regime or a leader, a dictatorship. And I'm not so sure if this moment is exactly dystopian, although there are certainly aspects of dystopia in it. COVID is, of course, a disease, a pandemic, a naturally occurring historical phenomenon, which could lead to a dystopia, but I think we're not there yet for all of the limits on our personal freedom that we are enduring right now. So we're not yet in a dystopia, at least for what I can see around me here in Italy and in Europe. Nor would I say, for example, the United States is in a dystopia. Over there has been an absolute free-for-all in the responses to this pandemic, to this crisis. Now, dystopia, of course, always gives the idea of great suffering. And COVID has brought great suffering, unprecedented suffering for people of our generation and younger. But it cannot be blamed on any one person or persons. And so, on any one person's. And for all the talk of us all being in the same boat, which is a kind of a cliche that is rolled out so often, it seems to me there is great injustice in the global response to this crisis, which is essentially every man for himself or every country for itself. And this is, in a sense, the equivalent of able-bodied men pushing women and children into the sea as the ship sinks, rather than helping them into the lifeboats. And this is one of the disturbing elements of our response to COVID. It really is the survival of the fittest, or of, better to put it, perhaps the wealthiest. What is evident is that our global health system was created to control contagion, fever, cholera, plague, but with a view essentially to protecting trade and travel and security of the powerful nations of the world. And we here in the richer countries have, to a disturbing extent, turned a blind eye to this suffering, to famine, to disease elsewhere, precisely because it doesn't affect us directly. Now, as I've said, I'm not going to say much about dystopia, but we'll do what I was asked, which is to talk about the COVID diary that I kept in the spring of 2020 during the first wave of coronavirus here in Italy. Italy, as you will remember, was the first European country to be hit head-on by the pandemic. And we had very little time or very few precedents to follow as we faced into the pandemic. So I began by publishing a long post on Facebook on the 10th of March 2020, which began with these words. I quote myself here. It should be obvious by now how serious things are here with COVID-19. It should also be obvious that this is not just an Italian problem, no matter how much politicians in other countries try to talk it away. What we have is a truly dramatic situation which the Italian government is trying hard to manage and contain. It wasn't obvious, and that's the end of the opening. None of this, however, was obvious. Just as Italy was in the eye of the storm, other countries in Europe were going on as though this wasn't going to reach them. I'm Irish, and I looked with particular concern at Ireland, and as the Irish Prime Minister was preparing to go, and indeed went, to Washington to celebrate St. Patrick's Day on March the 17th. And I looked to the UK, where the biggest race meeting of the season, the Cheltenham Festival, went ahead also in March, as though nothing was up, as did several big sporting fixtures, international rugby and soccer games. Going back to what I wrote on Facebook, one thing is sure, things will get dramatically worse before they get better. Hindsight will tell us that the entire country, by which I meant Italy, should have been shut down sooner. But that is of little help to Italy now, although it really should be of use to other countries that are a few weeks behind us in this deadly cycle, and that have an obligation to learn from the Italian example. And that's the end of the quote. And what was driving me crazy at that time was that we were in the midst of it. We could see what was happening, and we could see what was about to happen in other countries. And we could see country after country reacting just a little bit too late, stubbornly holding out that somehow it couldn't happen here. And of course it happened here and there and everywhere with monotonous repetition. And I go back to my quotation. Like people in Ireland today, people in Italy yesterday dismissed, denied, or underestimated the threat and tried to proceed with business as usual. It is hard to understand the ferocity with which coronavirus strikes until it actually strikes. So the countries not yet seriously affected must learn from those currently in the front line. And I suppose all I was trying to do in my posts and in my articles was to alert people to what was going on in Italy and what would soon be going on in their country. And so I spent the next 2 months writing a long daily diary designed to awaken those countries further west to the danger that was coming their way, describing the grim everyday reality of things in Italy, describing what it felt like to be surrounded by so much disease and death on a really unprecedented level. And at the same time, however, trying to find some solace or some comfort in literature, in art, and in historical precedent, trying to find some perspective with which to view this very changed reality. To my own surprise, when I finally stopped writing on the 3rd of May, so just under 2 months later, and that day coincided with the end of Italy's first lockdown, I realized that I had written more than 82,000 words, which will give you a sense of how the diary really did take over many hours of my day. And I would wake up every morning and the first thing I would worry about was, what am I going to write today? But of course, 82,000 words is what it is. I'm absolutely overwhelmed with too many words everywhere. The more significant number, now that I look back, was that by the 3rd of May, the most significant number was 28,956. And that was the number of deaths in Italy of coronavirus or with coronavirus by that date. So in about 8 weeks, we had lost 30,000 people. The curve flattened in May and stayed fairly flat throughout the summer until October, and the number of deaths as a consequence fell. Sadly, in October, it began to rise again. And as I speak to you now, the death toll here is around 105,000 people. So we are still very much in the middle of this crisis. We are currently in lockdown, and I'm speaking to you from my home. I have been to my university 4 times only over the past year. So we're desperately missing the normality of going into work, of meeting our students, of meeting our colleagues, of the community that we would normally be part of. I will go back to the university this Friday, but it will be simply to be given the first dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine. But to go back to last spring, to go back a year in time, every single diary entry that I wrote felt vitally important at the time. And I concluded my first entry with the following words, and I quote myself again. Sorry for the lack of modesty here. Yes, we should all wash our hands. Each and every one of us needs to be responsible, stay at home, avoid crowds, buy what is necessary rather than stockpile, talk on the phone, not at the bar, limit the damage, slow down the spread of this virus, which is so often as invisible as a phantom, leading people to believe that they are fine when they are not, and when they are in fact infecting others without even knowing it. And I think that was what was so frightening to us at the time. And what we found so difficult to understand was that we could be perfectly healthy and yet be passing on this virus. So even if we felt, as many of our younger people in particular felt, bulletproof, we could easily be spreading disease and causing more vulnerable people to get ill and even to die. So I said we needed to do all of these things. We needed to follow all the rules, or otherwise I suggested we could just stay at home and read Joyce's Ulysses, especially the playful litany in the Circe episode. Flower of the bath, pray for us. Wandering soap, pray for us. Midwife most merciful, pray for us. Potato preservative against plague and pestilence, pray for us. So it seemed to me that too many governments, their strategies were basically constructed on a wing and a prayer as useless as that of conjured up by Joyce in that episode. That first diary was published in the Irish Times, Ireland's principal newspaper. And in the comments section underneath, one of the readers wrote, "Good common sense advice from the front line. I shudder to think what this virus might do if the Irish health system, decidedly inferior to the Italian one, has to deal with something similar." Another reader was not so convinced and asked, "Why is a professor of English literature given a forum to advise the government on how it should respond to a health emergency? By all means, publish articles critical of the government's response by experts in public health care, but please spare us more articles by non-experts." Of course, the airwaves, the newspapers and social media have been filled with words from experts and non-experts over the past year. And what I was attempting to do was not really to give advice, but simply to describe what I saw on the ground here in Italy, to bear witness in a very real sense to what was an unprecedented and frankly frightening situation, to sound, others of course, an alarm bell that nobody really wanted to hear until it was too late. A few days later, in another piece which concentrated on what was happening in Bergamo, the northern Italian city, which suffered more deaths pro capita from coronavirus than any other, I wrote an article again for the Irish Times, but it was declined. It was turned down by the newspaper on the grounds, and I quote the editor, that I was not on the front line. Now, the Irish Times didn't have a correspondent in Italy, and it seemed to me, bizarrely, didn't seem to want to know. And this filled me with kind of sense of gloom and doom and disappointment. It seemed to me that Ireland was somehow in denial if it was using an excuse that I was not somehow in the front line. Yes, I was in Rome, I wasn't in Bergamo, but I was certainly close to what was going on. And it seemed to me a moral imperative, actually, to try and let people know what was going on. apart from feeling disappointment, it also spurred me on to try to keep getting the message out, which is basically why I hammered away on Facebook with a daily diary, about a dozen of which were also carried in the online Dublin review of books, which take and print 2 of the diaries each week. Now, the diary, I think, helped me to make sense of being alive through a difficult moment like this. I kind of got up every morning worrying, as I said, what I was going to write. And I just about made it through what I was supposed to be doing at the time, which was lecturing online. I was teaching 14 hours a week at the time. I was teaching Hamlet and Macbeth and Ulysses and various other things. But most of my other work fell by the wayside. I just didn't have the emotional energy to bang out more pages, more paragraphs about James Joyce. Things just seemed too serious, and I felt we were all called on to do what we could to describe what was going on, to try and bring people to see sense. And I thought that for every one person that is actually affected by reading a diary which explains how things are, this might just behave in a different way. And of course, the other side of the diary was to try and provide, through literature, some kind of nourishment or solace or consolation for people really struggling, I think, in the light of, 1, being locked down in their own houses, and 2, seeing so many people die around them, and 3, not being able to go through the usual ritual of death and commemoration and farewell that is so much part of all of our different cultures. Here's a quotation from the 20th of March, which conjures up what I felt was people's failure to understand what this COVID meant at the time and would mean into the future. So here we go. I quote, "I'm reading posts from people in countries that are a few weeks behind Italy, and they say that what is coming is a tsunami. Maybe it is, but it is also something worse than a tsunami. A tsunami is an extremely large wave caused by a violent movement of the earth. Its effects are immediate and can be devastating, but it hits and retreats and is gone. COVID-19 is equally devastating, but it does not just hit and retreat. First it looms, then it begins to bite. There had been just 1 death in Italy a month ago on February the 21st. And then it just keeps on biting. And as of yesterday, I wrote, the death toll was 3,405. What makes it so hard to explain to people in countries that have only a handful of deaths now is that Italy was in their exact situation just a month ago. And yes, I understand that Italy has an aging population and is therefore particularly vulnerable, and that no 2 countries will follow exactly the same pattern. Of course, it turned out to be true. No 2 countries did follow exactly the same pattern. And yet, if we back away from it a little today, we can see that there are great similarities in how various countries both reacted to and was affected by COVID, at least here in Europe. I go back to my quotation. If people have due warning about a tsunami, they get to safety on high ground. Countries outside of Italy have had ample warning about COVID-19, and they have a moral duty to ensure their people get to the equivalent of high ground. But it is up to each one of us. It remains very simple. Assume you have the virus and potentially could give it to others. Buy a mask if you can. Do a big shop. Go home and stay there until further notice. If that guarantees that lives will be saved, it is not a huge ask. And I end my quote there just to say that these things may seem very obvious to us now, but it was very difficult to find a mask at this time in Italy. I remember going to the post office and queuing up, and I was sending a package to Ireland, and the clerk in the post office insisted on opening the package because he thought I was sending masks abroad, which I wasn't. I was sending something else. At that time, there were massive queues outside the shops as people were buying more food than they could possibly eat, because there was a kind of a general, I wouldn't say panic, but worry that the food supply could somehow break down. So these things we needed to learn that we didn't need to react in this way, and we also needed to realize that what we were being asked to do was, yes, not simple and not great, but we were simply being asked to stay home. So I go back to my quotation. The phrase, the sanctuary of the home, has never seemed more apt than it does today. Sanctuary comes originally from the Latin term sanctus, meaning, of course, holy. More than ever today, the home is a place of refuge and protection. I am very encouraged, I wrote, by so many messages from Ireland and elsewhere telling me that people have understood the danger and are taking the right precautions, creating a sanctuary of sorts. And so I'm sure, like many of you who are listening, you shut yourselves up in your homes. And yes, they were a sanctuary, but of course, at times they also felt, and they still today somewhat feel, like a prison, because so many of us are missing so desperately our freedom, the freedom to just go out and about and in a carefree kind of way. Sadly, when I wrote that entry, I was more correct than I realized at the time, especially with the phrases, COVID-19 is equally devastating, but it does not just hit and retreat. First it looms, then it begins to bite. So this idea of a repetition of waves, and we didn't know that, but it felt like that was coming. Now, we all know that now. We are here in our third wave. And sometimes in this month of March 2021, it feels a little like we're playing Monopoly and we have been sent back to go, but we did not collect £200. Or it feels a little bit like we are all Sisyphus. We struggle to roll the boulder up the hill, and when the top comes into sight, we slip, and it tumbles down the hill again at such speed that we can do very little to stop it. And we've seen that build up so many times. We've got the numbers down, and then the restrictions have been loosened, and then gradually, and then with greater speed, sadly, the numbers begin to grow again, and we know we are back into another cycle of contagion and death. There is little we can do at that point to stop it, except stop, which is where we are today, even as I speak to you, stopped. My newspaper has just told me that yesterday or the day before in Italy, we had another 25,000 new cases. We had some 400 dead, and the death toll today is approximately 105,000 people. What they don't do anymore is tell us much about the dead. In an earlier period, we were given pen pictures of some of those who had died, particularly if they were medical or if they were well known. What we get today is a focus on inventing a vision of hope down the line, on the horizon, a vision of an end, a vision of a break. You know, it was last summer was to be a break, and it was. The arrival of plenty of masks, the arrival of Christmas, and now it's all about the rollout of the vaccine, which has in Europe been so messy. We look to the United Kingdom, which has had a far more successful rollout, and I suppose we see hope there because the numbers there, because of the vaccine, have come down so notably. Now, I've always said, and I said it repeatedly in my diary, that science will get us out of this. I wrote on the first day of spring 2020, I quote, "This is the 11th day of lockdown. It's not getting any easier, and the news is not for the moment getting any better in Italy. Yesterday, the deaths of 5 frontline medics was particularly upsetting, and TV last night was full of harrowing reports from the hospitals in Lombardy, which are at breaking point despite people working 18-hour shifts. Sick people are being treated in ambulances which have oxygen because there are no longer enough beds in some of the hospitals. Against this backdrop, we just try to get on with things." And what I have in the diary is a kind of an attempt to give the national picture and then to move the diary into my own home, and to show how one individual and his family are living through this. I continue. I am currently posting teaching segments to my students and trying to write a guide to Ulysses in Italian, which seemed like a good idea at the time. Like many of my colleagues, for me, it's a real struggle to stay focused. The computer is on all day, and it is hard not to keep checking the news and then checking it again. The more productive days are the ones in which I manage to rein in or limit this urge. At times, it is hard even to see the sense of such a project as writing a guide to Ulysses. Yet I believe in the importance of literature and the humanities at a time like this in helping us to frame and understand the human dimensions of what is taking place, the pain of death and loss and fear. If science will ultimately get us out of this situation, literature and art and music can play a crucial role in getting us through it. And my conclusion there on the importance of literature and art in helping us get through these difficult times, I suppose became a theme of many of the subsequent diaries, which looked increasingly to history and art and poetry as sources of consolation, but also as sources of perspective. And our job, my job as a teacher of literature, seemed to be to try and, share that sense with people in any way that I could, by looking to literature, as I say, for solace, but also for reminding people of the need for a critical conscience, let's call it that, in a world overwhelmed by fake news, false news, populism, demagoguery. So again, I quote, this is from the 22nd of April. So we're gradually moving through the period of this first 2-month lockdown. And I write, the problem is that these populists undermine public trust, undermine governments, undermine science and expertise, with passionate intensity, spread ignorance, lies, fear, and rage with their Twitter word bombs, which land often anonymously, do their damage, and disappear as quickly as they had appeared. In contrast, mainstream politicians and journalists fight back with reason and mostly polite arguments, all of which lack the necessary passionate intensity and are often too long and detailed, and necessarily so, but too long to fit into a tweet. This is a huge problem. How to salvage a vestige of reliable truth in a world bombarded by misleading noise, often voiced by our leaders. How to ensure people go with science, trust science. And then the inevitable, undeniable fact that COVID is but a prelude to what really challenges life now as we know it. And this sense was very strong for me, and is, that this was like a message of a sick planet whose illness we have been ignoring, pretending is not there. I talk about this in a diary at the end of April, and I quote, another of the depressing things about this crisis is that cities and countries that for years, decades, resisted sensible, low-cost, science-driven changes that might have helped reduce emissions are now suddenly embracing them. We now read of 23 kilometers of new cycleways being suddenly possible in a stroke in the city of Milan. This will, of course, be a great step, but did it really have to take a pandemic to make a simple change, a change as simple as this, possible? In Rome, there seems to be no such plans, and the divide between the two cities is greater than ever. Rome seems mired in its past, while Milan is looking towards the future, despite having been hit harder by the virus. Thus, in Rome, the fear is that when the lockdown is lifted from our homes, it will be moved onto the streets. In a recent interview, the engineer Stefania Di Serio, who worked for many years in the transport sector in Rome, wrote, the lockdown will move from our homes to our streets. The Romans, out of fear of contact and so as not to face long waits at bus stops, will choose to use their cars en masse, and therefore only those who have no alternative will use public transport, thus increasing the gap between the haves and the have-nots. With the increase in the number of cars, the buses will be slower and a lockdown will be created, this time with each person locked in their own car. And this is precisely, of course, what happened, because even though many offices remained partially closed or only had maybe 20% of their workforce coming in, those who could drove to the centre of Rome, drove to work, and we had a gridlock not dissimilar to that which we would normally have when things are or in inverted commas, normal. So we are, I said back then, in the bind. No one wants mass unemployment or economic hardship. No one wants the environment to be even more compromised than it is. We have to listen to science, which continues to say that big changes to how we live are essential. Younger people who are statistically less affected by COVID-19, that I wrote back a year ago, and now it's less clear, have made the short-term sacrifice of locking down with the rest of us so as to attempt the shocking flow of death among the older generations. In the future, sacrifices will be asked of the older generations in order to guarantee a sustainable future for those who are young today. In other words, the current generation and its leaders have to do the right thing for the good of the coming generations. Which is what those politicals who choose to get it have been saying for years. When Barack Obama announced policies to tackle climate change in 2015, he said, "We're the first generation to feel the effects of climate change and the last generation that can do something about it. This is our moment to get this right and leave something better for our kids." A few years earlier in his book, An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore wrote, and I quote, "Imagine with me that time has stopped for all of us. And before it starts again, we have the chance to use our moral imaginations and to project ourselves across the expanse of time, 17 years into the future, and share a brief conversation with our children and grandchildren as they are living their lives in the year 2023. Will they feel bitterness towards us because we failed in our obligation to care for the earth that is their home and ours? Will the earth have been irreversibly scarred by us? Imagine now they are asking us, what were you thinking? Didn't you care about the future? Were you really so self-absorbed that you couldn't or wouldn't stop the destruction of the Earth's environment? It seems to me that COVID in itself is a terrible difficulty, but it merely alerts us to the much greater difficulty, which is what Al Gore is talking about there. In 2015, the Irish poet Theodorgan posed a similar question in a stark but simple way in a poem called The Question. And I quote, "When the great ships come back, and they will, when they stand in the sky all over the world, incandescent suns by day, radiant cathedrals in the night, how shall we answer the question, what have you done with what was given you? What have you done with the blue, beautiful world? What have you done with what was given you? What have you done with the blue, beautiful world?" And this is a question that rightly haunts us right now. But I don't want to end on a grim note. When I stopped writing the diary around the 2nd of May, because I was exhausted by it, and because lockdown finished here, I felt the great need to go back to what I was, in a sense, paid to do, which was to write my guide to Ulysses, and to appreciate that book in a new way. I think for its appreciation of the quotidian, the normal, daily life. Ulysses was written during the dark years of World War I. It was written during the Spanish flu. It was written, therefore, at a time when normality was suspended. in Europe and in the world. And it's a book that proclaims more than anything else, I think, the importance of the quotidian, and it celebrates the extraordinary in the ordinary. Now, while well aware of the dangers of, for example, alcohol, Joyce brilliantly captured, among many other things, quotidian pub life in Dublin like no other. And then he does this in a very funny way in various chapters of Ulysses. He celebrated the everyday life, but also the everydayness of death. Okay, with grace and with great humor, but also with cutting realism. He was very much aware that we live in the shadow of the faithful departed, in the shadow of, and in company with the dead generations. After thinking back into the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, when Viking longboats ran up the beaches, Stephen Dedalus turns his mind to the 14th century, when, and I quote, famine, plague, and slaughters decimated the Irish population. He mentions two dramatic occurrences at that time: the stranding of a school of Turleyhide whales in 1331 and an unusually cold winter in 1338. So he pays heed to climactic change and to disease and to death and to slaughter, even as he attempts to celebrate a moment in which normality and these events are not taking place. Similarly, in Hayday's episode of Ulysses, Leopold Bloom reflects on widespread illnesses. En route through Dublin, past all of the statues of the dead, Leopold Bloom muses, and I quote, scarlatina, influenza, epidemics, canvassing for death, don't miss the chance. Now, Joyce published this episode in September 1918, just as the Spanish flu was beginning to take hold. He was sheltering in Zurich from the First World War, where the Spanish flu caused the death of one of the group of amateur actors that he was involved with at the time. And so the Spanish flu came fairly close to him. And as that did so, what does he do? He writes Ulysses, which affirms the value of life and daily life, and you know what we like to call normality. The Cyclops episode of Ulysses owes much to his father and to the Dublin that he left behind, but there is no sentimentality in it. Joyce managed to achieve a perspective from afar, from what he calls the safe side of distance. And today, most of us are living at a distance from our usual lives. There is not a thing wrong with allowing ourselves, therefore, to wallow a little, to value our now suspended habitual, and to celebrate the routine ordinariness of our usual lives. And there's nothing wrong with wanting a little of the normality to come back. At the same time, as we live through these difficult and challenging days and weeks and months and even years, there is no harm in realizing how lucky we have been in the normality we have enjoyed in our lives up to this point, in that everyday normality, which is for the moment frozen, and which we will have to, in any case, reinvent as we emerge from this crisis in the years ahead. This enforced distance, this pause, this enforced pause can help us to gain, I think, the necessary perspective to understand, I hope, what is vital and what is not. What we took for ordinary, but really will have to be extraordinary from now on, because clearly ordinary life as it was has put too much pressure on the planet, too much pressure on the ecosystem, which is our modern world today. So I think I'll stop there, and I don't know how it works at this point. Sebastian, do we have questions or?
Thank you so much, John. Yes, I just want to ask a couple of questions related to what you've just said. It was a wonderful presentation where you gave us a a full history of how you began to write that diary, and how it was at different points filtered through your readings of Joyce, and how that helped you, clarify certain points. The vision that ultimately emerges in those couple of months of your writing. The question that confronted you in the morning: "What do I write today?" That you said. It's a wonderful question. I mean, it's a question that confronts any writer, I guess. On any given day, what do you write about? And you said that the pandemic is a kind of a buffer, and something that leads on to the dystopian, not dystopian itself, in so many words. There are very interesting angles that have emerged in what you've just said and shared with us. You've also talked about the complexities. You've talked about the passionate intensity, of course, such a Yeatsian phrase, and how politicians, and you've used it in a very dystopian way, because you've talked about the way in which politicians mislead with a passionate intensity. Many of your diary entries have gone in depth into the machinations and the complications or complexities of Italian politics and European politics, for that matter, and how simple issues of life and death, health, and habitation, safety, the sheer humaneness of response, how these have been deflected and made awfully confusing because of political constituencies that needed to be dogmatically defended. So you've gone on, and you have mentioned political leaders, and how this is a problem that is more difficult to deal with than the pandemic, perhaps, which can be dealt in medical ways and with technological innovation. But what about the human handling of the crisis? And because everything, as you've just suggested, is mediated. Is mediated. How a pandemic, a death, everything has to be mediated. How does it arrive as perception to all of us, to the people at large? So, I didn't have a question. I cannot question a diary. I cannot question something that has come from the heart, but also so much from your deep experience of having read Joyce. Thank you so much, John, for joining us on this platform, being a part of this conference. You have enlivened proceedings immensely. You've given us so much to think about. You have also talked from Italy, one of the worst affected regions of the world, and which we looked at with such, you might say, trepidation, as you said, the death toll mounted over there. So thank you for expanding our point of view and deepening it also today, John. Thank you so much again for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
For having me.
Thank you, John. Likewise.